Good afternoon. My name is Greg Upton. I'm Associate Research Professor at the LSU Center for Energy Studies. Welcome to our panel entitled Decarbonizing the Global Economy, Balancing Economic Efficiency and Political Feasibility. Colleague Mark Agerton, Assistant Professor at the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Davis, co-organized a session with me and will be co-chairing it with me as well today. The session is hosted by the International Association for Energy Economics. So, anthropogenic effects of climate have garnered significant attention over the past several years. Although individual political jurisdictions, both in the US and globally, have implemented specific policies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, none of the top three emitting economies in the world, including China, the United States, and India, have implemented, I think, what economists would consider a comprehensive climate policy. Although the Paris Accord went into effect in 2016 and includes over 97% of global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions globally continue along this upward trajectory. So economists across the political spectrum have recommended politicians consider kind of market-based policies such as a carbon tax or cap and trade program to address greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the kind of textbook view is that market-based policies are the most efficient mechanisms to broadly reduce emissions across sectors of the economy at a relatively low cost. But politically, there's been little traction, in my view, for these market-based climate policies. Thus, the motivating question for today's discussion is really how can we balance pursuing a climate policy that economists would consider to be efficient with the political reality. And we have four distinguished panelists from different backgrounds who I hope will shed light on this complicated question for us today. First, we have Rabe Stavins, who's the A.J. Meyer Professor of Energy and Economic Development at the Harvard Kennedy School and Director of the Harvard Environmental Economics Program. Professor Stavins' research is focused on diverse areas of environmental economics and policy, including examinations of market-based policy instruments and regulatory impact analysis. Our next panelist is Barry Rabe, who's the J. Ira and Nikki Harris Family Professor of Public Policy and Arthur Thurnall Professor of Environmental Policy at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Professor Rabe's research is focused on the political feasibility and durability of environmental and energy policy. Next, we're going to switch gears away from the academic perspective with Adam Sieminski. Mr. Sieminski is the Senior Advisor to the Board of Trustees of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, KAPSARC, in Saudi Arabia. He served as the president of KAPSARC from April of 2018 to August of 2021. And from 2012 through 2016, he served as administrator of the EIA at the U.S. Department of Energy. He was previously Deutsche Bank's chief energy economist and integrated oil company analyst. And to conclude, we have Congressman Garret Graves. Congressman Graves represents Louisiana's 6th congressional district in the United States House of Representatives, which includes Baton Rouge, where I'm standing right now. So he is my personal congressman. For the 117th Congress, Congressman Graves is the ranking member for the House Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Aviation and is the ranking member for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. He also serves on the House Natural Resources Committee. Before being elected to Congress in 2014, he served as the chairman of the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, or CPRA as we call it. And so he really knows the effects of sea level rise on coastal communities firsthand. So the reason we've invited Congressman Graves to serve on this panel today is because he's a unique Republican who's publicly acknowledged the importance of this issue and has garnered national attention as such. So the remainder of this session is going to continue as follows. First, each panelist will be allotted between 15 and 20 minutes or so for some introductory remarks. Mark and I have provided each panelist with some motivating thoughts and questions, but we've also encouraged them to discuss the issues they find most important and topical. Next, we're going to open up to Q&A. You're welcome to type questions on the Q&A feature on Zoom at any time, but I'm going to wait until all the introductory remarks have been completed to ask the panelists, unless, of course, it's kind of a clarifying question, which I can try to put in there for you. Also, we know this is an issue that people have strong thoughts and feelings about. And so we just ask that all the questions are posed with the purpose of gaining understanding of the panelist perspective, not to engage in debate. So please be respectful. Finally, as you ask questions, please note that the session will be recorded. So without further ado, we're going to go in the order of the program. So Rob, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Greg and Mark, for having organized the session. Delighted to be on this distinguished panel with Dr. Sieminski, who I know well, with Professor Rabe, and with Congressman Upton. I'm going to use some slides, and so let me begin by sharing my screen. Which I assume you can see well. And so you can see that my topic really within this overall framework of decarbonizing the global economy is looking at COP26, the international negotiations which just took place, which I participated in Glasgow, and also relating that to U.S. climate policy, certainly of interest to many of you. I'm going to start by going through briefly two ways in which the science takes us to the economics and takes us to what is ultimately most important, really, which is the politics and geopolitics. One is spatial and one is temporal. The spatial one is, of course, the greenhouse gases mixed in the atmosphere. So the location of emissions has no effect on impacts. It doesn't matter if a ton of carbon dioxide comes from Boston or Beijing. It has the same impact in terms of climate change, both in aggregate and in terms of the location of the impact. So in economic terms, climate change is a global commons problem. That means something very important economically, namely that any jurisdiction that takes action is going to incur the costs of taking action, essentially the costs of typically moving from coal to petroleum and natural gas and renewables and nuclear within electricity generation, greater energy efficiency, renewable fuels in the transportation sector, and the like. But the benefit is that is the reduction in damages are going to be distributed globally. And therefore, the basic arithmetic is inevitably that for any jurisdiction, even one as large as the European Union, that the direct climate benefits it receives from its actions are going to be less than the cost that it incurs, despite the fact that the global benefits of its actions might be much greater than its costs or the global costs. That, of course, brings up a classic free rider problem, which is why international, if not fully global, but international cooperation is essential, and why the highest levels of effective governance, typically countries, are absolutely key. Now, as I said, there's also a temporal dimension that, again, takes us from the science to the economics and politics and policy. And that is that greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, accumulate for a very long time in the atmosphere. CO2 has a half-life in the atmosphere of over 100 years. And the damages, the degree of climate change is a function of the stock, the concentration in the atmosphere, not the flow in any point in time. Indeed, if CO2 emissions began falling globally tomorrow by 5% a year, which would be very significant, the rate of warming wouldn't begin to change in a detectable way until after at least 20 years. So the greatest benefits of climate policies are going to be in the long term because of the stock nature of carbon dioxide in particular. But climate change policies and the intended costs of mitigation are going to be upfront. Now, I don't need to tell Congressman Graves that the combination of upfront costs and delayed benefits presents massive political challenges in a representative democracy, because the political incentive in democracies is to give benefits to voters today, and if anything, to place costs on future generation. The climate problem is asking politicians to do precisely the opposite. So together, the global commons nature of the problem and this intertemporal asymmetry make climate change a very tough political challenge, which is why I don't find it surprising that it has not been addressed more aggressively. If anything, to some degree, it's surprising that the European Union has been able to muster what they have to put in place relatively aggressive policies. What I'm really going to focus on then, having established why there's a reason for international negotiations, is what happened at COP26. And I'm going to do this looking at 4 categories into which I'm placing all of this. The big issues that were in the press in advance, the ones that were really important to most delegates, the ones that were important to policy wonks like myself, and then a major issue that was the elephant in the room for everyone. In terms of the big issues for the press, the key issue was, do the old and new nationally determined contributions add up to consistency with the Paris Agreement 2 degrees C target, let alone the aspirational 1.5 degree target? The outcome was that before Paris, it added up to a trajectory of 3.7 degrees centigrade this century. This is from the IPCC. With the Paris NDCs, it went down to 2.7. With the updated NDCs that came from the United States, the European Union, United Kingdom, Korea, a few other countries, takes us down to 2.4 degrees C. If you add in all these additional statements, not commitments under any negotiations, but by many corporations about, net zero in 2050, if you put all of that in, then it gets down to about 1.8 degrees C this by 2050. Now, Prime Minister Johnson from the United Kingdom called it the last best hope. President Biden said something similar. I actually thought that kind of rhetoric was unfortunate because it misrepresents the nature of these annual negotiations, in which the target is not to solve the problem, but not to drop the baton in what is a relay race. Pass it on to those that come after you at the next of the Conference of the Parties. The outcome was that by the end, rather than pushing for more ambition at this Conference of the Parties, which is what the Prime Minister was doing in the first week, instead he began to press for more action at the next COP. In other words, essentially saying, I couldn't do it. I'd like those that come after me to do it instead. However, take note of the fact that after the conference adjourned, indeed 2 hours afterwards, the U.S. Chief Delegate, Senator Kerry, former Senator Kerry, as well as the European Union and the United Kingdom, all said they would not deliver more ambitious NDCs for next year's Conference of the Parties, have already done it, as they're supposed to do every 5 years under the Paris Agreement. Additionally, another big issue for the press is that some wanted a statement in the decision, which is called the Glasgow Climate Pact, endorsing the phase out of coal and the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. In the week before the COP, the G20 met in Rome. They did not endorse either of these, so it was clear to me it wasn't going to happen from the COP. And indeed, the outcome was that they put in some adjusted language, phase down unabated coal, unabated meaning coal that is not subject to carbon capture and storage, and reduce inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, which is ironic for economists to even say inefficient subsidies, since subsidies are by their very nature introduce inefficiencies, even when they're correcting market failures. The big issues for most delegations were different than those. Remember, most delegations, 2/3 of them are from developing countries. And the big issues for them were finance, this $100 billion commitment that goes back to the Copenhagen talks, and to make up the shortfall, because, of course, that hasn't been achieved. The outcome is that the wealthier countries are urged to double their commitment, which itself is ironic, to be urging countries to double their commitment when they haven't met their original commitment. But that's what came out of it. The other one that's very important for developing countries, and it'll be very important in next year's meetings, which are in Egypt, is referred to as loss and damage. This is the notion that even if there is a complete reduction of emissions, then we're still going to have climate change. Not all climate change can be adapted to, which is what the finance is for. So there's still going to be damages. And that's what the loss and damage is about. This is very important, as you can imagine, for the most vulnerable countries, in particular the small island states, for whom climate change is not just an increase in costs or a reduction of their economic activity, but is existential. So they have to have it. But the wealthier countries of the world and the big contributors to the stock, so the United States, Europe, and China, they looked at this as a prescription for unlimited international legal liability for bad weather. After all, you can never say whether that typhoon in Philippines is climate change or would have happened without climate change, or what degree. And so what came out of it then was a statement in the final decision, which is they will set up a dialogue for research and discussion at future COPs, which is the one moment at which I got sympathetic to Greta Thunberg's commentary the first week that these talks are just blah, blah, blah. What about the big issues for policy wonks like myself? Well, huge one. Could China and the United States return to global co-leadership on climate policy by returning to the spirit and the reality of intense cooperation that existed during the Obama administration, which has unfortunately evolved from cooperation to a spirit of confrontation during the Trump administration, which has unfortunately, in my view, been continued by the Biden administration. Now, the problems are not climate change. It's because of international trade, intellectual property, human rights, Hong Kong, security in the South China Sea. But climate change is collateral damage from that cooperation. In the second week, there was a surprise announcement by the USA and China, but it didn't advance ambition in terms of reductions, and it didn't influence other countries. So I couldn't say that that was achieved. The other big one, certainly for myself, so I've done a lot of research on this, is the one part of the Paris Agreement which had not been concluded in what's called the rule book, which was Article 6. And this is the place where carbon markets would be facilitated. I won't go into it more, can do it in Q&A if anyone cares. I'll just say that the outcome was not perfect. They could have done much worse. But it's a satisfactory foundation for going forward. And finally, on this, a big issue outside of the United Nations negotiations, 103 countries have signed on to a global methane pledge to cut emissions 30% below the 2020 level by 2030. Methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas, but it lasts for a much shorter time in the atmosphere. So in the short term, it's extremely important. The problem is that it's very hard to measure because of the sources of methane compared to CO2. So we don't have a good handle on that. I'll put in a plug that I'm now doing, just started a research project, or I'm about to, with a professor of atmospheric chemistry at Harvard. And we're going to be using satellite data through a statistical process in order to be able to estimate what the methane emissions really are from different countries in the world. And then finally, the issue for everyone, what I thought was the elephant in the room, and I thought would be discussed all the time, because I meet individually with negotiating teams at their request. And they know that I'm from the United States. So I thought what they would say is, hey, Stavins, is the US NDC, that's very impressive, that Biden announced in the spring, a 50 to 52% cut below the 2005 level by 2030. Is that achievable with reasonably anticipated policies? Well, my answer, as I'm going to justify in a moment, is probably not. But the surprising thing is that none of these groups with whom I met, the delegates, civil society, even the press, didn't raise this. They didn't complain about it. And I think the reason is that they are so happy to have the Biden administration instead of this Trump administration, because at least they could talk to them, right? And that includes those countries who were friendly with the Trump administration. But the Biden administration on climate is one they can talk with. So there was what I would call a remarkable willing suspension of disbelief. And this issue was hardly discussed in polite conversation. Now, I'm going to finish up by answering the question of why did I say that the UNNDC is probably not achievable? Maybe that's obvious now, but what I'm going to lay out for you, I had actually written in an article that was published a year ago before the inauguration. So I want to take some credit for having said this before the recent political developments. is it achievable with reasonably anticipated policy actions? Not policy actions that you put in a press release or an announcement from the White House or from a congressional committee for that matter, but that are reasonably anticipated to be able to be enacted by the two houses and signed into law by the president. The only way that that target could be achieved would be with aggressive new legislation. Everyone here knows about the fact that 60 votes are required in the Senate, and there's currently a tie, so 51 votes exist at best, unless budget reconciliation is used, but that brings up its own problems, including 2 Democratic members of the U.S. Senate who don't support using it. So the prospects for major comprehensive climate legislation are not good. But there's also non-climate legislation that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A good example is the infrastructure bill. Electricity upgrades are important for greater reliance on renewable sources and greater penetration of electric vehicles. There's aspects for EV charging stations, subsidies, and the like. And then there's some truly bipartisan climate change legislation that could be politically feasible, in particular subsidies, since at least the elected officials with whom I work don't like to give out costs, but they love to give out benefits to their constituents. And that's what subsidies are, usually through tax incentives. And this would be for wind and solar power, which we've had in the past, and we're fully bipartisan, carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, technology initiatives, electric vehicle rebates. And some of this, in fact, we see in the legislation I was just mentioning. But if you add all of that together, in terms of what's possible, it's not going to satisfy the demands of domestic Greens, by which I mean the advocacy groups and the so-called progressive Democrats in the House of Representatives, or international calls for action. So the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, is going to have to opt for regulatory approaches.
And 5 minutes or so.
Great. And here, what I'm thinking of are executive orders that would reverse Trump's regulatory rollbacks. That's the problem with the regulatory approach, is that many of them can simply be eliminated by the subsequent administration. We're going to see the CAFE standards put in place, which are very aggressive, although not as aggressive as Obama's CAFE standards were. These are the fuel efficiency regulations that affect motor vehicles. The methane rule for methane leaking from wells and pipelines, that's probably going to be reinstated. And then there is a new rule that actually came during the Trump administration that will implement the Kigali amendments for CFCs to make us in compliance with changes in the Montreal Protocol, which is extremely important. And recalculating the social cost of carbon, something economists care about. I don't know about others, so I won't say more about it. But the problem is that new regulations are more likely, in my mind, to be challenged successfully during the Biden years than they were during the Obama years. And that's because of 245 Trump-appointed federal judges. That's more than 25% of the complete federal judiciary. And probably more important, the Supreme Court's 6-3 conservative majority. And not just conservative of any kind, but conservative of the pattern of the late Justice Scalia, of favoring literal reading of statutes, giving less flexibility to departments and agencies. Indeed, we may even see a modification or overruling of the very important Chevron doctrine. It's been around for decades, under which federal courts deferred to the agencies when Congress was not perfectly explicit of what it wanted. So I'm going to close with 2 sources of optimism for U.S. policy action, because perhaps that sounded pessimistic. One is that this is the United States of America, and state-level policies and actions can be effective. We have important subnational policies on the West Coast and the Northeast, and to some degree in the upper Midwest, and these have become more important with a lack of federal action. Indeed, it could be that we see that the so-called blue states, that turns out to evolve a bottom-up national policy. And you might think that's not much. If you look at a map, it's a small part geographically of the country, but it's more than half of the U.S. population and an even greater share of economic activity and greenhouse gas emissions. But my last source of optimism is simply in terms of the individuals, not so much the institutions or the structure, which we as academics like to think about, but the individuals. And that is, this administration seems to be embracing first-rate scientific and other expertise. And with some of the best scientists, lawyers, and even economists, a lot of my students are there, they may be able to design sound climate policies that are not only great policies on paper, but that can perhaps be politically feasible. And I hope we'll hear about that from Congressman Graves later this morning. So with that, I'll just say thank you. And I know I've spoken fast, went through a lot. Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, Harvard Environmental Economics Program, I direct both of those. Lots of free papers and information, my website, my blog, or please follow me on Twitter. I have, I think it's 999 to go to get to 6,000 followers. So I'm hoping I can add at least one or two today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it. All right, next we're going to move to Barry.
Thank you, Greg. And first of all, I want to thank you and Mark for conceptualizing this conversation today and for inviting us, and also my co-panelists, beginning with the very thoughtful remarks just a few moments ago by Professor Stavins. And hopefully I will build on that, playing the role here, speaking to an audience principally of economists, how a political science framework or lens can think about some of these very issues. I think it's interesting to consider these questions in the context of the immediate near-term prospects, but also to think about the fact that this year represents the 25th anniversary from the creation of the Kyoto Protocol, when hopes were so high that an economically sensitive and politically feasible global strategy was within reach. And when it was widely assumed that the United States would emerge and sustain a role as a technology and policy literature. Those were pretty heady early periods where both economists and political science, using different models, theories, and specific policy precedents, were confident or pretty emphatic that the world was going to move aggressively in these areas. And so a question I've struggled with, and I'll share some thoughts today, is what have we learned about the politics of climate change since Kyoto, almost a quarter century ago? What is politically feasible? And what are the prospects for the next quarter century of climate politics, where we've got some pretty serious challenges ahead? And I organized my talk really with the questions, Greg, that you shared with the panelists as possible framing questions, and I'm going to organize them in order of sort of three large themes. One is, what do I, in my case as a political scientist, consider to be optimal climate policy? I recognize and respect where economists come out on this issue really with the focus on efficiency. As a political scientist, I think about in democratic and federal systems like the United States, that an optimal policy is one that is politically feasible through democratic channels, sustained by multiple branches and levels of government, and it is a policy that endures across multiple election cycles and partisan shifts in control of government. For domestic policy, that means legislation the old-fashioned way. A Congress or a state legislature bicameral passes legislation, and an elected executive, a president or a governor, signs it into law. For international policy, that is a treaty negotiated by the executive branch, but endorsed by a supermajority of the United States Senate, as is consistent with Constitution. That rules out as suboptimal things like executive orders, action plans, agency reorganizations, far-reaching regulatory reinterpretation of existing statutes, like the Clean Air Act, that would rule out things like the Clean Power Plan as a suboptimal policy, or the merged fuel economy tailpipe emission standard regulatory program, not as things we shouldn't do, but as clearly suboptimal. And from the international side, that would mean ruling out non-treaty executive agreements, where the executive branch cuts a deal with one or more international partners and finds a way to bypass the treaty ratification process. Paris, the Global Methane Pledge, the North American Climate Summit agreements that have taken place in 2015 and now again in 2021. Optimal policy, from my perspective, must be durable across the policy life cycle, not just being created through adoption, which is where we tended in political science to spend most of our time. That's just the beginning, because as we have all learned, climate policies, even if adopted, often do not self-implement and can quickly be reversed. Can you stand up the policy credibly through public management mechanisms? Can you navigate elections and inevitable loss of policy entrepreneurs and advocates for policy? Can the policy sustain and expand support over time? Can you adapt or adjust it over time? And can you deliver performance outcomes related to emissions and economics in a reasonable amount of time? We don't have a huge number of American success stories over the last quarter century, federal or state, that have really run that gauntlet, although we have some. I would argue the closest that the United States may have come through to federal climate policy, optimal climate policy 25 years ago after Kyoto was mentioned briefly by Professor Stavins, the 2020 American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. An 85% phase down of hydrofluorocarbon production and use over the next decade that puts the US, in essence, in alignment with Kigali international targets. This is legislation that had broad legislative support. It was ultimately passed in December of 2020, not exactly a high watermark in the life of the American Republic. 36 Senate co-sponsors equally divided between parties, and a remarkably clear and crisp piece of legislation where the proposed rule and the final rule were promulgated in less than a year, and implementation has moved forward. How did this happen? There were clear industry divides, and many firms and many technology leaders did not want to be crowded out of opportunities to advance their project by clinging to HFCs. Here we saw a role for states, not just as potential models, but a rapid horizontal diffusion process. We went from one state with HFC policy in 2018 to 15 by 2020. A rapid diffusion process that actually put pressure on the federal government to consider vertical diffusion, as opposed to devolve HFC policy to as many states that decided to get into the game with their own policies. And then external pressures. The fact that it was increasingly recognized in the 116th Congress that because of Kigali and ratification elsewhere, if the US did not get on board over the coming years and by 2033, Americans would lose access to export markets because of their non-compliance with the process. That's one shining example out of 25 years. There are a few others. And it does fit a pattern of more bipartisan legislation that actually is still empirically feasible. Here I'm drawing on the landmark work of James Curry and Francis Lee, the best work we have seen on the politics and the functioning of the American Congress in the last 25 years. But it is very hard to replicate this in any other area of climate policy. Why? One, and Professor Stavins said it extremely well, you have front-loaded costs and long-term benefits. You can dress those up in subsidies and other kinds of ways, but it's hard to get around this. Two, climate policy does not exist in a political vacuum. In the US post-Kyoto, we have seen a largely broken legislative branch of government, regardless of partisan control of the two chambers of Congress. We have seen not just for climate, but other areas, prolonged periods where Congress has not been able to speak clearly. Other areas of the environment. It is now 32 years since the last reauthorization of the Clean Air Act. 35 years since the last reauthorization of the Clean Water Act. Let's move away from environment, immigration. 36 years since the last piece of comprehensive immigration legislation passed a Congress and was signed into law by a president. We've also seen across the last 15 Congresses, roughly 30 years, an inability to provide basic policy guidance on a wide range of issues, not just climate. That means in a system like ours, the power of the presidency and the executive branch for its current office holder expands dramatically. And the real counterbalance of power may be less Congress, but states led by the political party opposite the president. This is something that Frank Thompson, Ken Wong, and I discuss in a book published right before the 2020 election called Trump, the Administrative Presidency and Federalism. And it marks a major shift from legislative branches at both the federal and state level to executive politics, which opens up all kinds of questions about durability and the like. And fourth, finally here, beyond Congress, American democracy and the functioning of its system in 2021 is rather fundamentally different what it was in 1997 and 1998. If you look at things like the Democracy Index, and this is work that my colleague Daniel Fiorina in his book, Can Democracy Handle Climate Change? Has raised. The US is in a fundamentally different ranking now in international analyses of what kind of a democracy we have. Back when Kyoto was adopted, the United States was a top 10 performer in all the major metrics of what constitutes excellence in democratic systems, including satisfactory functioning of government, checks and balances on exercise of power, free and fair elections, and on things that we can measure and do measure over time. When Kyoto was first put together, the US was a full democracy. We have since steadily, consistently slipped into the second tier of a flawed democracy. Outside the arena of climate, when you look at the functioning of the American government, we are no longer compared to Canada and the Nordics. We are compared in that flawed category with countries like Mexico and Italy. That represents huge challenges for the functioning of any new policy area. So that's the larger themes that I would raise on optimality. Now, a second question, Greg, that you posed was what compromises from optimal policy might significantly improve the political feasibility of the proposal? Briefly, I would submit our neighbor to the north, Canada. Europe tends to get a lot of the attention as one of the more functional systems, but the Canadians are also quite interesting. They've struggled with these issues as the United States has. They have a very difficult time passing and adopting new policies on climate. As recently as 9 or 10 years ago, things like carbon pricing were widely thought to be politically dead in Canada because of the strong issues and objections. And so how on earth, at the very time the US was disengaging over these last 5 or 6 years, and the US has maintained a formal carbon price of zero, has the Canadian system moved to a $50 a ton Canadian carbon price intended for 2025, and now had a government that has twice secured re-election going to an even larger carbon price of $170 a ton? How does a politically challenged prime minister like Justin Trudeau achieve that? And out of the 5 major political parties in Canada, have 4 of them actively on board with this strategy? Well, you can look at sort of larger external factors. Canada remains a full democracy where the US is no longer one. Survey data suggests that Canadians take climate change much more seriously than the US. You ask the same question in the 2 countries. At the same time, there's about a 10% difference. Here I'm drawing from some of the landmark work of Eric Lachapelle at the University of Montreal. I would also argue the Canadians still know how to make federalism work. The basic quid pro quo of compromise in a federal system, an art that we've largely lost in the United States. They know how to move money. They know how to tax. They know how to use revenue allocation. They know how to use mixed instruments. It is sloppy in some respects. It is not maximally efficient or optimal by any stretch of the terms. And yet they've been able to pull these pieces and themes together. Even the Pan-Canadian framework looks at individual provinces and states and says, in effect, if you're an early adopting province, you're grandfathered. We fully recognize what you're doing and keep your money and do what you're doing. If you're a province and you're willing to negotiate with us, we can work out terms. If you want to play hardball, and if you want to refuse to develop a carbon price, that's okay. We're going to impose one. It's called the federal backstop. And guess what, provincial political officials in those jurisdictions? We'll gather the money and we'll return all that money to your citizens in your province or territory in the form of a rebate or a dividend. And you, the political officials in those states, won't get any political credit. There's much more to it than that to understand the workings of the Canadian system, but I think it's so interesting to see these two fossil fuel giants side by side. For most of the Kyoto period, they've struggled, but the Canadians seem to have kind of cracked the cosmic egg in things like climate, carbon pricing, and even methane and some of the other areas that are really challenging in the United States. Finally, the last question that you posed for us, Greg, in your recent message was, how can we seize real opportunities to work across divides that may be unique to a particular nation or region? I'll offer a few examples here, and I'm drawing in part on some of the great work that's being done by my governance studies colleagues at the Brookings Institution, folks like Darrell West. One is, one of the empirical results we've seen in the development of renewable energy over the last 10 or 15 years is that red states, whatever their political opposition to mandates and carbon prices, are empirically more likely, and it's politically easier, to cite new renewable energy, to get approval politically for storage and transmission than blue states. There's no correlation between how bold or ambitious a state's carbon action or climate action plan is and how willing they actually are to accept renewable energy adoption. Imagine putting that into a creative federalism negotiation or conversation in the United States. Also, this issue of climate change, I think, increasingly needs to divide carbon dioxide from other short-lived climate pollutants, HFCs, but each form of methane. We tend to look so intensively at carbon. We've done much less at short-lived climate pollutants, where, at least in theory, their immediate intensive impacts may change that political cost-benefit calculus. We're beginning to see more of these issues and perceptions begin to emerge. But here I would argue the policy literature in both economics and political science has been so relentlessly focused on the carbon question, with some very notable exceptions in both disciplines. We've kind of taken our eye off the ball on methane, black carbon, and other short-lived pollutants. Two last points. I want to make the argument as a political scientist, believe it or not, to a group principally involving economists, that I think the death of carbon pricing, even in the United States, is greatly overstated and exaggerated. I would encourage economists to keep thinking about ways that you might be able to compromise on some of your models, engage in a little bit of horse trading, and look at how ways that perhaps not optimal carbon pricing, but second-tier carbon pricing might be politically feasible. And let me offer some empirical observations from what I think we've learned about when carbon pricing does and does not work in the United States, but elsewhere. One is policy complementarity. I think there's growing evidence from some jurisdictions around the world that carbon pricing can be part of an ensemble, complementary, especially if well-designed with other policies. Look at Virginia in 2020. Razor-thin Democratic control of both legislative chambers and an executive branch and Democratic control. Passed simultaneously bills to create a clean energy standard, but to backstop that and integrate it with membership in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and very creative revenue use to make that plausible. Upstream versus downstream. Technically, there's a difference. Economically, there's a difference. Politically, there's a big difference. I think there's abundant experience to say that the more you move upstream, the more you increase the political feasibility of a carbon price, especially if you're prepared to allocate revenue to jurisdictions that are producing energy. Offsets. This is the Humpty Dumpty of climate policy. In theory, it is possible to do it, but offsets have become so laden with baggage, so toxic to weigh and consider, that I would argue one has to approach that with extreme caution, not just in the US, but around the world. I'd also argue that what we've learned in recent years, and certainly in the 117th Congress, is that the pitch that has been made, including by many of my political science colleagues, that non-pricing policies are better politically, isn't necessarily the case. Look at how badly some non-pricing policies that were argued to be politically superior to a carbon price have fared in the 117th Congress. The Clean Electricity Performance Program, which was indifferent to economic considerations and analysis, which helped scuttle that pretty promptly in the 117th Congress. The Green New Deal idea that you could take climate policy and staple it together with healthcare, higher education policy, daycare policy, all of these things, and build this large, grand coalition and not create warfare between those different constituencies. The Green New Deal policies and the ideas of that larger coalition are really, really tough to pull off in an American context. And to me, one of the biggest surprises about the 117th Congress is how, in an era where the conventional thinking is that carbon pricing is politically impossible, at least in the United States, is how well some of the pricing-like policies have done. The methane fee, which passed the House of Representatives, the restoration of the Superfund tax on chemicals, and the separate one on oil and gas. And finally, the royalty increase on BLM properties. None of these are pure carbon prices, but I would not have anticipated, given the rhetoric of the last campaign and the overwhelming set of arguments that carbon pricing is a metaphysical impossibility politically, that these would have lasted in the game as long as they have. One last comment, if I might. I would really hope from conversations like this, we can begin to do something I've wanted to see happen for a long time. And that is for economics and political science to kind of end their Venus and Mars relationship when it comes to carbon pricing and climate policy more broadly. I am really struck in political science how when we refer to economic concepts and ideas, we rarely cite economic literature. Most of my colleagues don't read economic literature and kind of caricature it. I'm also increasingly struck as economists move into the area of what I would call politics, how rarely they cite this growing work that's being done in political science or engage these issues and questions. And certainly in my areas of policy engagement, whether that's been developing a carbon neutrality plan and a carbon pricing strategy, by the way, at the University of Michigan, or working behind the scenes with federal agencies, I just see more and more and more all the time a need for some of these linkages and connections to come together, which is one of the reasons, again, Greg, why when you and Mark made the suggestion we do this, I was delighted to accept the invitation. So with that, I close and I thank you.
Thank you. These have been two very pragmatic and compelling presentations. So Adam, the floor is now yours.
Greg, I'm going to ask your permission to do something a little bit different there if the congressman is willing to do it. There were a lot of comments made by both Rob and Barry about the political outlook and the need for political change. And I wonder if the congressman is chomping at the bit a bit to respond to some of those. And I'd be happy to yield my order in the queue. And if you'll let me come back at the end and talk about what a big producing country is trying to do about all of this, I can do that in 10 or 15 minutes, actually. And I would be delighted to yield my spot in the queue to the congressman. I got to tell you, Congressman, that I'm both saddened and delighted at the same time to tell you that I'm 7,700 miles and about a day and a half away from some of the finest pies in all of the United States, from Lee's Lunchroom up past Cheneyville, and I bet you've been there. So I would really appreciate an invitation if you think you could handle that for me after all this is done. But why don't you go ahead and respond to these comments, and I'll come in and talk about Saudi Arabia after you, sir. Thank you.
That's great with me, if that's okay with you, Congressman Graves.
Sure, that's fine. Just before I start, I want to make note of a few things. One, I made a last-minute decision to do this from home. I've got 2 dogs, 3 kids, and a wife who wants to take my hat off right now, so you may hear a little background noise. Didn't finish
well, thanks
all
for being here. We appreciate it.
No, hey, look, thank y'all for the opportunity to join, and I want to thank both the professors for their presentations. I was just texting some of my coworkers, and I said, I think this might be the most rational climate discussion I've had in months. Climate's kind of become a religion to where we're no longer grounded in science and fact, and it's become this emotional issue, which has been really fascinating. Professor Stavins talked about some of the challenges and the political realities, and that you, in many cases, pay now, yet you have benefits over a much longer period of time. He also made the very appropriate point that things can't be solved if you recognize this is a problem. It can't be solved domestically. And let me be really clear when I say that. We can stop all emissions from the United States today, everything, and it's not going to truly have an impact on what we're seeing in regard to concentrations globally. The Professor Rabe mentioned how important it is that we push solutions, that we proffer ideas that are politically feasible. He talked about how we've got to make sure that things are politically durable, that they can sustain multiple elections. So I couldn't agree more with both of those statements from both professors. I thought it was very well grounded statements, and I think it's something that has been missing from climate debate or climate discussion for many years. If we're gonna follow the sort of the guidance, the recognition that the two previous professors have made, let's talk a little bit about history, and let's recognize some things. Let's recognize that historically, and Professor Rabe noted how Congress has become very dysfunctional and partisan. There's a great 90-second YouTube. Any of you, even with ADD, can check this out. It shows the partisan. It depicts the partisan relationship in Congress through dots, through blue and red dots, and it shows this change over years to where 70 years ago the votes were all together and intertwined, and over time they have become two very tight balls, and that you've got the red dots over here, Republicans, blue dots over here, Democrats, and that's how votes are happening. And that's where this ideology, the parties have become more powerful. It's taken power away from the individual members of Congress and really instilled it in the leadership. And so the focus on the country, in my opinion, has really dropped off. And instead, there's more focus on how can I advance, not America, but my political party. And it's really unfortunate. Now, the founders, the framers of the Constitution were incredibly wise in that they set up three distinct sort of sets of responsibilities, obligations, or power. Yet with Congress being as dysfunctional as it is, that power is not being exercised. And I think that's why the previous professor talked about how in some cases the executive actions are a little bit more relevant because Congress can't figure out how to get unwrapped from the axle. Yet the power doesn't go away. It's now being absorbed by what some folks would say are activist judges, and others would say overly aggressive administrations of their executive orders, but it's largely because Congress has become dysfunctional. And so that whole concept, idea, or objective to find solutions that are politically feasible and sustainable or durable through various elections is becoming increasingly challenging. Now, one of the things that we've done in an effort to try to address that issue that I mentioned earlier, where climate has been this very polarizing issue. You bring up climate change, Republicans go to this corner, Democrats go over into this corner. So let's figure out how to talk about this a little bit differently. One thing that Dr. Upton and I are intimately familiar with, and we both wish that we weren't, is sustainability. We are getting we're getting pounded by hurricanes just in the last several years. Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac. In last year, in 2020, Laura, Delta, Zeta, and then two other clips by other storms. This year, I'm getting my years. Last year, Hurricane Ida, which was one of the most powerful hurricanes to make landfall. And so sustainability is a really big issue, the resiliency. But you know what? It doesn't matter if you're flaming liberal or if you're rock hard conservative. Everybody wants resiliency. The hurricanes don't discriminate. So let's focus a little bit on resiliency. How can we resiliency, sustainability, adaptation? How can we work together, develop trust and relationships based on that? You know what we did in 2018, largest investment in history in adaptation and resiliency. We're making extraordinary progress in some of our efforts in Louisiana that's lost about 2,000 square miles of our coast as a result of sea rise subsidence, very poor management of the Mississippi River, and other issues. So that's an area where we can come together, the adaptation, recognizing, as Dr. Stavins said, and I personally think that was a little aggressive, but that we're not going to see benefits in the environment for 20 years. I think some of the models show that real benefits are probably even decades beyond. And so this is an area where we can come in, we can address adaptation. It is a climate issue, and it helps to buy us time. Secondly, now I'm going to put on my President Trump hat for just a minute because both of you, while you didn't directly say it, you sort of indicated that the Trump administration Republicans maybe weren't as willing to jump into some of these discussions. Let me say it again. I think it's a language issue. If I go into a discussion and I say, "Hey, I want to save the environment to a group of Tea Party conservatives," you know what? Probably not going to get a ton of attention. I want to convert everything to solar and wind and hydro and geothermal. Probably not going to get a lot of attention. But if I come into a room of conservatives and I say something like, "Hey, you know what? You know how President Trump worked with Republicans and they reduced taxes on individuals and corporations to try and improve global competitiveness? You know how President Trump worked with Republicans and others to renegotiate trade deals to make sure that the American workforce had a level playing field? Do you know how President Trump worked together with Republicans to help reduce the regulatory burden?" Well, you know what? I've got an idea that's complementary to that. It is coming in and making additional investments in energy technologies and strategies that are going to help to reduce energy consumption for when we're building widgets in the United States. And it's going to help to reduce energy prices for individuals. And we're going to do this through energy conservation and efficiency measures. All right. Now, in that room of rock hard conservatives, that resonates because it is discussing things where Dr. Stavins, you get benefits that you can actually see in the shorter term by reduced utility bills. It's complementary to some of these efforts that I mentioned earlier, the trade and the tax and all that, because it helps to reduce our cost of building widgets, which makes us more globally competitive. Now, if I'm in a room of ultra liberals and I'm talking about the same damn thing, you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to come in and I'm going to talk about it from the emissions and from the environment side. But you know what? The solutions that we're talking about, it's the same thing. And so I think in some cases, we've got to think about language, words we're using. I think we've got to think about how to break up this climate thing into individual bite-sized, digestible pieces, as opposed to coming in and saying, we're going to save the world. Now, I'll tell you some other things, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on kind of this conservative approach because I do believe it's one of the areas where we've got more work to do. And not to say that there's not work to do on the liberal side. I think there's work in both places, but I think we've probably got more socializing to do on the conservative side. So something else that I like to make mention when I'm speaking to Republicans is I remind them that between 2005 and about 2017, the United States reduced emissions more than the next 12 emissions reducing countries combined. All right. Number two, if you take that to about 2020, it's somewhere around 7 reduced emissions more than the next 7 emissions reducing countries combined. The head of the IAEA said that what the United States has done with energy emissions reductions has been the greatest reduction in energy emissions in world history. What are those incredibly radical, hard left policies that we've done to achieve those drastic reductions? You know what we've done? We've largely migrated to natural gas. That's one of the biggest components of that emissions reduction. Natural gas in the United States has about a 41, according to NETL, the National Energy Technology Lab up in Pennsylvania. We have about a 41, 42% lower emissions profile than Russian gas going into Europe, and I think it's 47% going into Asia. That's delivered. This was a study that they did in. Y'all are all professors. You're gonna want to double check me, but I think it was October of 2019, if I remember right. Happy to get it to you if you'd like to read it. Great study. But so if we were to come in and if we were to basically eliminate the supply of Russian gas into Europe, which is somewhere around 30% today, you would end up reducing tens of millions of tons of emissions annually just by supplanting U.S. gas with Russian gas. This is a global issue. And so we've got to stop looking at it so myopically. Now, let me take that and expand on it even more. As Dr. Upton noted, I'm also the ranking member on the aviation subcommittee. I do a lot of work with the airlines. So we've been working with the airlines in sustainable aviation fuel, on new designs for airplanes, trying to reduce emissions, increase efficiency. When I started looking at some of the cost of squeezing out that last 20% of emissions from planes, you're looking at from air travel. You're looking at numbers in terms of reductions, cost reduction per ton when you start getting above, let's say, 80%. Give me a whole bunch of wiggle room. But you start getting into incredible numbers, looking at numbers in some cases in excess of $1 million a ton in reductions. At some point, it doesn't make sense. Dr. Stavins appropriately noted, and I'll rephrase it. The environment's agnostic. It's agnostic as to how you reduce the emissions. One of the problems with the pay now, benefit later scenario is that if we're going to come in and we're going to spend gazillions of dollars on the front end, and we potentially are going to see benefits in the long term, depending on what the international community actually does, that's a really hard sell. Perhaps a little bit different approach is looking at where we can get the most efficient reductions. If I can go right now, as Bernie Sanders does, and I can buy a carbon offset for, I think last time I looked, $12 to $15 a ton for Bernie Sanders' flight, why would I go spend $1 million a ton on aviation, on getting that last 20%? Why would you do that? And so what it does is it brings down that front end pay and ensures that that you're not looking at these incredible costs and as polarizing or divisive legislation like the reconciliation bill that was referenced earlier. Something that we've got to think about, and let's see, I believe it was Dr. Stavins who also, I believe you also talked about subsidies, and so one thing that we've got to think about, solar energy is great and wind is fantastic and geothermal and wave and nuclear and hydro, they're all great when they make sense. But back in the 70s and 80s, when we began subsidizing many of these technologies, the plan was that this was going to be a subsidy for 10 years, maybe 20 years, and that then these things were going to be sustainable, economically sustainable. Something that is ignored in many of the strategies now, and again, going back to Dr. Rabe's comments, is that these things have to be politically durable, but they also have to be economically durable. We always talk about environmental sustainability. We've got to talk about economic sustainability. You can't come in and distort markets in these very intrusive, abusive, and exorbitantly expensive ways and expect it to be sustained through different political environments. One of the worst things we're seeing right now, you had President Obama who has leftist environmental policies, then Trump comes in and does things over here, and then Biden's coming in and doing this again. If you're industry, if you're an energy company, where in the world do you make investments? You've got the most irrational, unpredictable future that you can possibly imagine. If you're looking at a 10 to 20 year investment strategy, where do you make investments? And so I want to come back to what Dr. Rabe, and I hope it's Rabe, not Rabe, I apologize, but what he said, it is so important that we come together talking about things that are rational, that are politically sustainable, that are economically sustainable, that are environmentally sustainable, that we bring more science to the table, not less, that we look at strategies that have worked, that we talk about how, for example, the clean power plan that was mentioned earlier, that was going to reduce emissions by 33% off a 2005 baseline by 2030, reminding folks that even when President Trump came in and threw out the clean power plan, do you know what? We actually hit 33%. It was 32% reduction by 2030. We hit 33% reduction in 2019, whenever the standard had actually been thrown out. And so again, giving Republicans assurance that we're not asking you to make a 180, we're asking you to double and triple down on strategies that actually work. We've got to stop this ridiculousness, this lack of science, and go out there and put the big bullseye or death knell on fossil fuels, whenever the reality is, you look at the IEA numbers, you look at the EIA numbers, or whoever, you are going to see a surge in demand moving forward for natural gas. Why would we supply it from Russia and other countries that have greater methane and other emissions than supplying it from the United States, where we produce it safer and cleaner? And not to mention, you temper economic impacts and you create jobs. So being more rational, I think, is so important as we move forward. And I kind of just went on a big diatribe and had a bunch of notes. I don't think I covered much here. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to hit.
You've got about 5 minutes, but right. It's, you take your time. Yeah.
I may turn some of it back in. Let me just look real quick here. Something else that's really important, to keep in mind. Dr. Stavins, you're the economist. Based on some of our numbers, it appears that China's economy, in terms of economic output per ton of emissions, is about 3 times more inefficient than the U.S. And so when you transfer manufacturing and production activities and economic activity over to China, it results in greater emissions. In Russia, it's about twice. And so we've got to make sure that we're not carrying out policies that are so incompatible that's what's going on internationally, that all it's going to do is squeeze that balloon and make it pop out in Mexico, Brazil, China, India, Russia, wherever else. And I think that's so critical as we move forward. And it helps out with the ability to politically accept some of these things, because it's not causing the economic damages in the United States. Y'all mentioned EVs, so I'll maybe mention that and close up. But with electric vehicles, we were doing some back of the envelope numbers, looking at over the life, if you do the $7,500 or $12,500 tax credit on EVs. Right now, the cheapest combustion engine car is about $13,000. The cheapest EV is about $31,000. And when you look at that subsidy that they're trying to put in place, and you look at the actual reduction in emissions, we were looking at numbers, I think, depending on different scenarios, on a low end about $1,200 a ton, on a high end somewhere around $1,900 a ton in emissions reduction. Let me say it again. I can go plant a tree, $8 a ton? And so we've got to be more thoughtful about how we're doing this. But I want to make note, I've got 2 electric vehicles, 2, not 1, 2. And one of the ways, Dr. Stavins, I think, where we can come in and provide that benefit now, where you pay now and benefit now, is looking at solutions or technology that provide better performance. And so that's a way of getting the benefit now. You know what? I like my electric vehicles for driving back and forth to the office, doing little intercity travel. That's where it makes sense. If I'm going long haul, if I'm trying to pull a boat or a horse trailer, it makes absolutely no sense at all. And so it's another way for us to look at, like the efficiency and conservation, reducing energy costs, another way for us to look at, or for us to try and provide that benefit now, rather than just those longer term environmental benefits moving forward. So I know I covered a lot of ground in an awful sequence, but I appreciate the opportunity to join you all and look forward to a little bit of Q&A.
Thank you so much, Congressman. We appreciate it. And we'd love to have you stick around, but if you got to get to your family, we understand that as well. So, all right, Adam, the floor is yours.
All right, let's see if I can share the screen. And with any luck, you're seeing my slides.
It looks
Right?
perfect. Yep,
Okay,
looks great.
Look, everybody knows this, but I want to put it up because I just want to say that Saudi Arabia acknowledges that temperatures are going up, that it's a problem, and that doing something about it is necessary. And a lot of people don't understand that. This is the problem that Saudi Arabia has, and Congressman actually spoke very nicely about it. If all you do is focus on reducing fossil fuels, and there seems to be a big contingent that wants to do that, there are areas that have no practical solutions for abatement. Congressman Graves mentioned aviation. There's maritime shipping. There's heavy duty trucking, cement manufacturing, metal smelting. There's a second class of problems, and there are a lot of people in the world that don't have a whole lot of energy at all. There's still, depending on whose numbers you use, 1 billion people that don't have electricity, 1.5 billion people that don't have clean cooking fuels. And, if you thought about it, you said, look, propane for clean cooking fuel is a pretty good solution. Then why don't we do that and try to find some other way to deal with the emissions associated with the propane? And I'll come to, is there something that we could do? Keep in mind that the UN's Sustainable Development Goals called for affordable, reliable, modern energy, access to that for people. The third category of problems is we've got a huge amount of infrastructure, whether it's ports, pipelines, power plants, existing production facilities for natural gas and oil that will require a lot of money, significant cost and time to replace. And I think what we learned, or we're learning, is that focusing on the demand side immediately without focusing on supply could lead to shortages and higher prices. And that seems to be not a particularly thoughtful pathway towards a solution. I think that the congressman's points that he made, and let me go over those again. I like them so much. We should do something now to buy time. We should, second, try to find language and policies that everybody understands. The third point was that natural gas can be part of the solution. Let me please add that I think oil can be too. Fourth, that the environment is agnostic on how reductions happen. And now I'm going to talk about what the circular carbon economy idea is. And that we try to produce everything as much as we can where the emissions are low, or at least move in that direction. The idea that's on the screen here now, the circular carbon economy, really starts, and it says, look, we used to have a linear economy. In oil terms, you produce it and you burn it, and in widget terms, you produce it and you dispose of it. You put it in a garbage dump. We then said, we really need a circular economy. We need to reduce the production of goods in the first place. We need to, that's the efficiency angle. And we should reuse and recycle those as much as we can. And the idea of the circular carbon economy is to say, look, we need to add remove in there. It's a fourth R. So not only do we want to reduce, reuse, and recycle, but we want to remove, and we need to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere in some way. And that comes back to Congressman Gray's point about it. It really shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter which of these R's you're using as long as you're getting the job done. That there are people that say, I'm in love with remove, or I'm in love with recycling, or I'm in love with reduce, when they ought to be in love with all of those things. And so that's the idea. I was going to give you some example. I mean, what falls under reduce is efficiency, renewable energy, nuclear power, reuse and recycle. There are a lot of things in there. Enhanced oil recovery is one of those. But increasingly, we're moving towards the idea of being able to use CO2 to create polymers, carbon, chemicals, CO2 to fuels, carbon and other materials. For example, concrete can be cured with CO2, and it might be stronger actually than water-cured concrete. And that could be huge given the continuing need for concrete globally as development occurs in places like Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Finally, the remove option is not just carbon capture and storage in geologic reservoirs. It can also be nature-based solutions, things like mangrove restorations, which could be done in Louisiana, by the way. And I'm sure that would help with some of the coastal flooding issues associated with hurricanes. This is something that's being pursued very aggressively in Saudi Arabia, and I'm going to come back to that. The G20 countries last year endorsed the idea of the circular carbon economy platform. Basically, they said they bought into that idea that, okay, we understand that something that's voluntary and integrated and pragmatic should probably get the support of everybody, even if it includes nuclear power, for example, which a lot of countries in Europe don't like, or oil and carbon capture and storage, which a number of people don't like. The idea, I think, that the G20 was trying to promote was that the concept of the environment being agnostic is true, and that we should use all of the tools in the toolbox. Can't build a house with just a hammer. You use all of the tools that you have available to you. I feel a little bad about this one. What Barry Rabe said was that he was a little concerned about some of the kind of voluntary, but not necessarily enforceable policies that could be put in place. But I think this is one of those that came up at the climate summit back in April. Canada, Norway, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United States all agreed that they would try to find, as large oil producers representing about half of global oil production, would look for ways to reduce hydrocarbons towards net zero. And the idea of methane abatement strategies was part of that. I actually thought the methane pledge, and I heard Rob Stavins say this too, that the methane pledge was actually a positive outcome of Glasgow. I agree with that, even though it wasn't on the agenda in Glasgow. It was kind of part of the atmosphere there. Methane is a huge problem, and fixing methane flaring and methane unflared releases could be very, very important. Pushing on clean carbon technologies is also good. And so now I want to show you what they're trying to do here in Saudi Arabia across all of the 4 Rs. There is a national program that is being formulated. You'll hear more about that this year. That includes some things that have already been underway, like energy efficiency. The Saudis have a auto fuel efficiency program that's pretty similar to the one in the United States. They have air conditioning standards. Air conditioning is a huge draw on electricity in the kingdom and in the region, is in Asia as well. I think the International Energy Agency said that the fastest growing need for electricity is for air conditioning around the world. And there are standards in Saudi Arabia for that, and working on that technology and getting standards in place, a really good idea. There's a move in Saudi Arabia to get away from heavy fuel oil for electricity production, use more natural gas, by the way, about half of the mix, and half of the mix coming from renewables, mainly solar. There's a big green hydrogen project underway up in Neom, which is in the northwest part of the country, It's one of the larger ones in the world, and there's real money behind it. Planning is underway, contracts are being signed. There are similar things that are going on in reuse and recycle. And I mentioned remove. The Saudi Green Initiative has big ambitions to reduce greenhouse gases. There was an announcement a couple of months ago by 2060, a similar date to the Chinese. If you say, well, why not 2050? I think the Saudis actually feel very strongly that they want to be able to deliver on what they promised, and they felt that they couldn't promise it for 2050, but they could for 2060 and make it happen. Saudi Aramco has a corporate scope 1 and 2 wholly owned operations target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. By the way, the nationally determined contribution from Saudi Arabia was roughly doubled, and Saudi Arabia joined the methane pledge, and Saudi Arabia is going to have a lot of greening up that's taking place. About a year and a half ago, KAPSARC, the think tank that I am at and was running before I moved over to the board of trustees at KAPSARC, is engaged with a number of international organizations to write up a lot of the ideas and concepts behind reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. We are working with the International Energy Agency, with the International Renewable Energy Agency, with the Nuclear Energy Agency, and the OECD, as well as the Global CCS Institute on a series of reports. They're all on a website there. You can find that, cceguide.org. The reports are actually fairly good, and we are continuing to add to those. We're working on one now that says, look, ESG, environmental social governance investing has to include some of these more practical ideas of things like carbon capture and storage, or we are not going to be able to actually achieve the goals that were set in Paris. That you can't just do this with, reduce or with renewables alone, and that's really important, I think, to find how we can make the financing side of this work for everybody. Okay, one very practical thing that's going to happen, I believe, here in Saudi Arabia, and I think in Houston, Gulf Coast, I think Louisiana could be part of this because the infrastructure is down there in many ways, and there are going to be efforts underway to create hubs. And it's a hub that includes hydrogen and CO2 and a lot of the industrial activities associated with using fuels like natural gas and oil in Saudi Arabia, just to the north of the area where Aramco is in the eastern province. There's a town called Jubail. It's an industrial city. The idea is to put a hub into Jubail where you could connect up a lot of the producers associated who are creating the CO2 by burning hydrocarbons and find ways to use the industrial areas. And again, that's kind of like the Texas, Louisiana, Gulf Coast area to produce hydrogen. It would probably be blue hydrogen. But again, that's back to the environment doesn't care whether the CO2 reduction comes from blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. What you need is to reduce the carbon dioxide. And if you can do that with blue, it's good. So we talked a lot about this, or everybody did earlier. This is my last slide. I'm just going to wrap up on this. We talked a lot about policies, but we need technology and possibly policies to push those technologies. And we need to establish markets. Let me just go through these technology. We have to prioritize the solutions based on the costs and maturity. And we need to advance those technologies, and we need to get R&D and pilot projects going in a lot of these areas. Direct air capture, as an example, is something that probably deserves a lot of government attention from the labs, from the taxpayers. Policy mechanisms to enable deployment of new technology and to better use technologies that already exist. We need measurement, reporting, and verification systems. This isn't going to fly if people don't believe that real reductions are actually taking place. And I think that the markets side of this is it's got to be done at scale. That's why the idea of carbon hubs, a hub at Jubail, a hub in the Texas, Louisiana Gulf Coast area, a hub in Rotterdam, maybe one in Singapore. I think that there you could get the size, investment, and scale that's necessary to actually make a real, true effort at this. And I want to end on a comment, and I think I heard the congressman say this too, and I just want to reemphasize it. And that is, we've got to find ways, and it's not going to be easy in the near term, but I think it can be done, where this can be value added, right? Where you're making money at doing this rather than looking for subsidies. I think the congressman said we need to. It was kind of like focusing on the language that the Republican side of the aisle, I think, understands. Competitive to businesses, opportunities for profit. I think that's the direction that Saudi Arabia is going to try to take on this. I think they're going to be looking. Enhanced oil recovery is doable. They're experimenting with CO2 to methanol and urea fertilizers, and there's some progress being made with the research underway at King Abdullah University for Science and Technology, one of the big technology science universities in Saudi Arabia, on concrete curing with carbon dioxide, just as an example. We've got to find ways to turn this from being a burden on the public budget to one where it's value added. Now, it's not going to be done overnight, but it is happening in some places already. We just have to find a way to accelerate the move towards that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to jump in there. And I'm truly, really looking forward to the discussion period. So back to you, Greg.
Adam, that is so fascinating, because just the language you're using of carbon hubs and value added is exactly what the people in the Gulf Coast region, the industry, is talking about on a daily basis. So to see that in the Middle East is fascinating. So at this point, we've gone through our four panelists. Mark, if you want to pose the first question, we'd love to have it.
Sure. First of all, thank you to our really fantastic panelists. I teach an environment and resource economics course, and we're just about to start talking about taxation and Pigouvian corrective taxes for environmental externalities. That, Congressman Graves, you talked about not wanting to have high cost abatement options when we could go for the low cost abatement options. The $1 million a ton aviation versus the $8 tree, and that's not what we're seeing as much in practice, like a global carbon tax or a global cap and trade that economic theory says would get us the fastest, least cost carbon reductions. Instead, we're seeing a lot more piecemeal policies. Rob, you talked about this, and Barry as well. Subsidies and taxes on particular things, administrative rule changes, CAFE standards, and those are a much more piecemeal approach. So I could see on one hand seeing this piecemeal approach that we're seeing in practice being a move in the right direction, or even like a politically constrained efficient solution. But it's also possible some of this would fail the cost-benefit test, or maybe be counterproductive in the long run. Give us the appearance that we're doing something, not deliver the reductions, and then burn our political capital for potentially more costly policies. So how should we think about this more piecemeal approach that we're starting to see in practice versus the textbook solution I teach in my class? Is this just sort of a recognition of political constraints and something we should be building on, or I teaching the wrong thing in class? I'd be interested to hear kind of what all of y'all's thoughts are on this area.
So I think that there is quite reasonably a difference between identifying what you could call the most dynamically efficient policy and what you would call the optimal policy. Presumably, if we're determining what is an optimal policy ex ante, then we're going to take into account whether or not it can be enacted and implemented in the given jurisdiction. And that obviously leads to the conclusion that in some jurisdictions in the United States, currently stands out in this regard, that what would be, in theory, dynamically efficient, a national carbon pricing regime where the carbon price was at something like the social cost of carbon, doesn't appear to be politically feasible. But what can happen is that carbon pricing policies that are truly would be efficient, that are first best, can be made to be at least second best in terms of how the revenues are used, which goes to the heart of what Congressman Graves reasonably pointed out, and that is that we want to create a current generation of beneficiaries, not just waiting decades for there to be beneficiaries. So you take the revenue from auction allowances in cap and trade, or you take the revenue from a carbon tax, and then redistribute it in ways that can begin to build a constituency for the policy. That's not some great new insight of mine. That's in fact in legislation in the previous Congress, probably be again for either cap and dividend programs or carbon dividend programs, depending upon if they're cap and trade or carbon tax. But beyond that, I would go further. And I hate to do this at the ASSA meetings. I don't want to have my certification withdrawn, but the time is ripe in the United States for economists to begin to work on non-carbon pricing policies, on ways in which the insights from economics can look at non-carbon pricing policies to make them cheaper. In other words, to make them more cost effective. And that could be done, for example, with the electricity trading system, which was proposed and then was taken out of the legislation. That kind of standard can begin to be made cost effective by thinking of making it more tradable across jurisdictions and the like. But there are all sorts of policies to which economists could contribute more. I don't disagree with what Professor Rabe said. I mean, he's saying that, carbon pricing is the holy grail, and for the long term it is. And also there are 61 jurisdictions around the world, very significant ones, that are using carbon pricing, 31 cap and trade, 30 carbon taxes. Obviously, the EU is out in front, but also, Korea and lots of others I could enumerate. So there is progress, but in the US, I think we're an outlier in this right now.
Any other comments on that question?
Sure. Just make note. Look, politically, just want to be very realistic. I don't think that there's an appetite in Congress to do a carbon tax. I understand, not as well, obviously, as Professor Stavins, but I understand that the best way to I guess, or the most efficient way from an economic perspective to reduce would be to put a tax. I generally understand the concept. I think you've got a few things that come into play that give Congress a lot of hesitation there. And number one would be the competitiveness factor. So if you impose a tax unilaterally in the United States, what does that do to us in terms of our international competitiveness? And you say, oh, well, look, you just come in and you do a border adjustment tax. Got it. But then you really get into some incredible complexities of how do you calibrate that compared to other countries for each individual product and market. It becomes this thing that makes people like my head explode. And so I think that the concern about how it would adversely affect U.S. competitiveness is an issue that comes in. We've seen, and we're talking about Kigali earlier. China's out there saying, "Oh, we're not releasing any, CFCs yet." You see from the satellites that they've got them all over the place, and so I think that there's a trust issue. If we're setting a calibration or a border adjustment based upon stuff that China's giving us, yet it has absolutely zero integrity. There are concerns there, and just again going back to the whole thing, the whole concept I brought up earlier about imposing cost or paying now without folks seeing a requisite benefit, I think would be a huge concern. And one of the things as I was looking over my notes, I talked about how the U.S. has led the world in reducing emissions, but it's important to note for every ton of emissions the United States has reduced, China's increased by 4 during that same period of time. And so here you're talking about bringing in strategies that potentially are pretty disruptive and possibly economically harmful to the United States that may not even end up causing global benefits because of what China and other countries are doing in regard to the direction they're moving in regard to their emissions. And of course, that's consistent with their commitments or NDC under the Paris Accords, which would result in they're already releasing more than the United States, the EU, I think Japan combined, and they're going to get to increase another 50% between now and 2030. So it's very difficult to be able to convince the United States that this is something that's truly in our interest.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point of, and we can teach to our students as theory, but the practical application can be really tough. So yeah, absolutely. Go on, Professor Rabe. Absolutely.
If I could just jump in quickly, it does strike me that, again, as we look across different pollutants or different sectors, different policies may or may not come into play. And so here I would go not to CO2, but CH4. And Mark, I'm mindful of some great work that you have done with Ben Gilbert, who is in the audience, on approaching methane through a fee mechanism. The idea for this emerged in conservative red states and was driven in places like Wyoming and North Dakota, not because it was a big tax, but because venting and flaring methane to the atmosphere is the waste of a non-renewable natural resource. And so whether it's Louisiana or any other state that has a severance tax, there are formal exemptions in state tax code written to methane. And the politics of this are really, really tough at the state level, because every time it's been proposed in Cheyenne, Bismarck, or anywhere else, you have this large, unusual coalition come together and say, we really like this idea. And it's not just environmentalists, it's farmers, ranchers, school boards. It dies because the industry threatens to move to another jurisdiction. But I do think, and this is partly why I think the methane fee has done pretty well in the 117th Congress, the idea of better measurements through technology, as Professor Stavins talked about before, and some use of regulation, but also financial provisions here could be kind of interesting, especially if it's really true that America is moving toward leadership in reducing its methane down to less than 1% of produced gas, which we know is just not the case in both the Permian Basin and the Bakken. But if you look at where some of those fees and taxes have been set, especially if you can do the metrics properly, high-performing firms pay no price at all. And then you can begin to move in a direction, going back to your point, Adam, on the global methane pledge. And to be clear on that, I actually think that's a terrific step forward, given what's been politically possible. I worry about its resilience and durability because there's no congressional buy-in to it. But as we begin to think about competing with Russia for liquefied natural gas exports to the European Union and other places, at some point, we're going to actually have to be empirically credible and prove that there's low methane content on that gas. We can't just say we're the US and we're great and our emissions are low, because we know they're not. And we know they're all over the place. And so perhaps measurement and pricing is one way to get at that.
Those satellite reports now make it pretty hard to hide your methane flaring or venting. And it turns out Saudi Arabia actually has a pretty good track record in that. They put a big master gas system in place here several decades ago, and because they wanted the gas, they needed the gas for electricity and industrial uses, and it kind of goes to, I think, the Saudi strategy, which is to try to have the lowest carbon footprint that you can have as an oil and gas producer, right? And then that way there's presumably a market for your product. And if you can then move on towards some of the remove options, you might actually be able to offset a lot of the carbon emissions associated with the remaining part of the footprint that's not low. Back to you.
Awesome, thanks. So my question, it's kind of motivated. One of my mentors here at LSU, who's an economist, who's done a lot of work in the political arena as well. He told me, he said, and this is, I guess, true across like state and national politics, but that, elected officials are really good at listening to their constituents and really understanding what is it that their constituents want? What are they telling them? And they're very good at listening. And if they're not, well, that's going to be kind of a problem. So it makes sense that they're good at that. But what's a lot, I think, more difficult is kind of explaining, as you've gone and studied an issue, you've listened to what your constituents have said, you've studied the issue, you've talked to these subject matter experts, of kind of explaining the nuance. And sometimes how, a viewpoint can evolve. And so I think climate's a good example of that, in that it's kind of a complicated issue. And so perhaps Professor Rabe and Congressman Graves, do you all have any sort of comments on how we can improve that communication and how we really wrap our heads around that kind of communication with the general public?
I'll jump in, take a first shot, and then hand things off to the congressman, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I do think, Congressman, what you were saying earlier about, find the words, the language or even the framing that you use becomes really important. This is where, actually going back to some of my earlier points, the declining capacity to make the federalism system in the US work to allow for hard intergovernmental negotiation and bargaining is really tragic in climate, but lots and lots of other areas. And it's one of the things that I do think underpins why more effective federal systems, and amongst the systems that tend to have the most robust climate policy regimes, including carbon price, they tend to be federal or multi-level systems with highly functioning democracies. How you regain that and recapture that is challenging. And yet a lot of my work actually involves traveling to states. So I literally spend time with state legislators from oil and gas producing states, many of whom claim they have never met with an academic concerned about climate change and assume that I'm walking in with my little Brookings Institution affiliation on a search and destroy mission. And when the door is closed, we have really, really fascinating conversations. It opens possibilities of log rolling, trade-offs, and all the kinds of things that are possible. And I do think, I'll make my last point here and then exit to the congressman's comments, bundling together benefits that you're going to be providing to states and linking that with expectations of performance environmentally is important. So I never would have put $5 billion in a handoff package to states to deal with orphan well remediation. That's pure bailout. It's because states and industries have failed to deal with these issues, and they now need a federal bailout. Same thing in Canada. I would have put that into a package and developed a long-term fund and say, states, what are you going to do to improve your performance on methane or other areas? That's exactly what the Canadians did. But to do that, you have to be able to have adult conversations on federalism. And that's really, really hard to do in the US. But I really think, and this is relating to larger questions about the survivability of the republic much longer, if we're really going to be able to function in a number of areas, we have to engage some of these sub-federal unit kinds of issues more successfully, and look at how different people see these very different issues.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yes, so certainly from a political perspective, and keep in mind in the House, we run every 2 years. So, just going back to Dr. Stavins' comments about paying now and potentially benefiting later, we run every 2 years. I'll tell you that I've never had a constituent come in and say, hey, if you could figure out a way to, drive up my energy cost, increase inflation, and, help me lose my job in the energy sector, that would be great. It doesn't happen, right? And so, number one. Number two, look, y'all are professors and you understand the complexity. I'm not going to say you understand this issue. You understand the complexity of this issue. It is one of these issues that is so ubiquitous. I mean, it affects absolutely everything. You talked earlier about Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. We talked about vehicles. We talked about resiliency. This thing's all over the place. And so let's be fair and clear that in talking to constituents, probably similar to talking to members of Congress, we've got to take this in very bite-sized pieces, things that are understandable, digestible, communicable. And so that's why I think it is so important to be thinking about language, to make sure that you are meeting people where they are, whether that is a energy worker in South Louisiana or it is an environmental activist in California, meeting people where they are, making sure that we're talking in ways to where we're truly communicating and not out there talking past one another or having these polarizing discussions. And, just go back. I don't want to repeat myself. Just go back to that criteria that I mentioned earlier that I think is so important whenever we're considering policies that actually have staying power, that are durable, and then for industry, for investors, are those things that are predictable and provide certainty for long-term investments.
Yeah. So, Congressman, if you don't mind putting on your spot, how do us as academics, economists, and political scientists, and people with background in government and industry, how do we help you do that as a congressperson who's going up for election every 2 years and is, constantly traveling around their districts, meeting with their constituents?
So, look, I mean, I'm not kidding when I tell you that I picked up my phone when Dr. Rabe was speaking, and I said, I hit two folks that I work with and said, I think this is the most rational climate discussion that I've had in months. I really did. Like it just because what ends up happening, Greg, is that whenever you're in discussions, whenever you're in congressional hearings, it is one party trying to find some witnesses that are going to be as far, left as they can and reinforcing and trying to, completely shame the other side and make them look like idiots. And then you've got the other ones, the other side that's doing the same thing. How can I find a far right that's going to be beating the hell out of these folks and making them look like idiots? It's not constructive. It's not. It doesn't get anywhere. All it is it's out there, singing to the choir and just reinforcing these strategies and opinions that go back to the pendulum swinging thing that I was talking about. So, to answer your question, look, the way to talk about this in South Louisiana, where we have hurricane issues, where we have a lot of conventional fuels, oil and gas related jobs, where we have extraordinary coastal loss, and we have opportunity as was mentioned earlier on the whole remove and sequestration issue, where we have some of the greatest geological and geographical opportunities in the United States, right here in South Louisiana, to do sequestration. So that's going to be a very different conversation than you would have, let's pick on California again. In California, that has very little conventional fuel production, that has very little conventional infrastructure outside of the, Santa Barbara and Bakersfield type area. You have very little of it. And so there are no consequences to going out there and saying, hey, we're going to stop all fossil fuel production. We're going to stop all use of fossil fuels in the United States. So it's a very different discussion over there than it's going to be in Louisiana. And I think it goes back, as we've mentioned a few times, It just goes back to meeting people where they are, language that people understand, that they can digest, and doesn't cause that immediate, arched back and chest pushed out, and this person's coming after me, my job, my family, my livelihood, our economy, our economic security. But it's that here's a benefit for you now. We're going to bring in some resiliency investments and help make your community safer and ecologically sustainable. We're going to come in and we're going to provide new industry and opportunity through doing sequestration in this community. We are going to be continuing to produce energy here, but we're going to be doing a little bit different in terms of methane capture, and we're going to be doing some exports. I mean, I think it's all about meeting people where they are, using language that they can understand, and helping them to understand some of the benefits to them or some of the trade-offs to them, perhaps in shorter periods of time.
Hey, Greg, if you'd let me, I'd like to give a 2-minute kind of maybe a practical way to try to answer your question, and along the lines of Congressman Graves. What I was tried very hard to do, and I think with some success when I was running the Energy Information Administration and KAPSARC, was to move the research from being purely academic to having at least a part of it being more timely and more relevant and more policy oriented. Right. So if you were saying what should I mean, there is a place for basic research in every university, obviously, and I'm not saying all research has to be policy oriented, but it would help if some of it were policy oriented. And let me come back to the Congressman knows this better than I do, but I've seen plenty of polls. If you ask people, what are you worried about? What are you thinking about during an election? The one that's always at the top, always is jobs and economy. And the second one that's always in second place is health care. My health, and my and now it's COVID, but health in general. Third is usually some kind of a feeling of security. Sometimes it comes out as crime or immigration or whatever, but it's a feeling of security in your house. And I think being worried about hurricanes might be something that would really motivate people to want to think about. And the fourth one tends to be, I want to make sure that my kids get a good education. Climate change, unfortunately, is down at the bottom of the list. So let me reframe your question. How do we get climate change to come from the bottom of the list towards the top of the list? And I think you got to frame it in that in climate change is going to help to create good jobs and profitable companies. Climate change is going to help improve your health. Climate change is going to help improve the security of your home and your family. And then I think you're selling something that the average voter that's got to pay for this wants to do. I mean, and it's not a whole lot different here in Saudi Arabia, believe it or not. I mean, in the region. I mean, people want to see things get done. They understand that something needs to be done, but they have other things. The thing at the top of the list here in Saudi Arabia is jobs in the economy. It's just like the United States. That's what. And so we need to find practical ways to make the climate solutions cheap enough that they're affordable and they can really be put in place at scale. Thank you.
Can I jump in on that just to say, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of Professor Rabe and myself, that those of us who are teaching not in economics departments, but in schools of public policy, whether it's the Ford School at Michigan or the Harvard Kennedy School, part of our responsibility, our mission, and what we do is to engage in the policy world. Before COVID-19, I was down in Washington, I think, as much as I was, in Cambridge. And having said that, I'm also going to give a plug for something that's not my institution, and that's Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C. I suspect that Congressman Graves has been involved with them. I'm vice chair of the board of trustees, so it's somewhat self-serving. That's a fantastic institution of a group of economists, environmental and resource economists, who are completely focused on working a lot with people, staff, and members on the Hill. So I think there is quite a bit of that. Greg, probably there is not as much as there should be, but I just want to represent that there is quite a bit that's happening.
Yeah. You want to go with the next question, Mark?
Sure. So we've mentioned a number of times about how carbon is a global problem, so it doesn't matter where CO2 is emitted from. We've also heard a couple times about carbon leakage and competitiveness as being objections, especially to unilateral U.S. Action. So the idea, if we regulate the U.S. oil and gas industry, we'll reduce U.S. supply, and some dirtier producer will just produce in our stead. Or maybe if we implement carbon regulations here in the U.S. that does nothing about Chinese coal plants, and maybe we've given up some sort of strategic advantage in negotiations, or we've just had a new rule that's totally ineffective. So how should we be thinking, practically about prioritizing these domestic versus international concerns and efforts? And are there some trade-offs that we should be recognizing here to domestic versus the international?
Yeah, and we have less than 5 minutes left too. So if we can try to give a broad or quick.
I'll give you a 30-second answer too. I think that what you need to do is to look for ways to value every country's unique circumstances and accept and value whatever they can do. I mean, it might, even if it's suboptimal, suboptimal is better than nothing. And we can move towards optimal, as the technology evolves and costs come down. We're kind of doing that with solar and wind, for example, and we need to do that in a lot of other areas. So that would be my idea: is let every country try to do as much as they can do within their own unique national circumstances.
So I'm going to modify that a bit. I hope you can take this as a friendly amendment, Adam, and that is, this is a global commons problem. If it's left up to individual countries who pay the cost, but the benefits that they get directly are less than the cost, which is inevitably the place, arithmetically, that's a fact, then we're not going to do much. That international cooperation is required. But so the two have to go hand in hand. And the nature of the international cooperation we have now, which is the Paris Agreement, which I support and I've worked on a great deal, is such that it really is, as Adam said, left up to the individual countries. The Paris Agreement, with the little targets that everyone comes up with, the NDCs, are not binding under international law. It's just the overall structure that you've got to come up with one every 5 years. That's binding under international law. But you say what you want. But what is binding and what really matters is the domestic policies that are put in place, at least in the democracies, in order to achieve those. So the two have to be together. There has to be this international cooperation, in my view, whereas we don't need that for local water pollution problems and hosts of other environmental issues. But we do need it here.
Congressman Barry, would you like to weigh in?
So one of the things, look, absolutely, you've got to have the international format, and we can sit here and debate all day long about Trump getting out, Biden, not worth it to have the discussion right now. You've got to have the international format. You do. I was at the COP as well, and it's absolutely critical that you do that. But also, let's be realistic. We just had the 26th COP, and emissions are still going up. I would have fired every single person that was on my team if that was the performance. This is a disaster. So international cooperation has to happen. But as Dr. Stavins just said, you've got to look at it through your domestic lens. One of the things that I often talk to some of the people I work with, the way I talk to them about it is how, look, we're the board of the directors for America. And our strategy in the United States is going to be a different one than Mexico or than China or whatever else. We've got to look at our strengths, our assets, and figure out how to achieve objectives moving forward that as I've said, that is affordable, that is clean, that is reliable, and is exportable. Meeting those four criteria using the assets that we have. And we can't go out there and say, hey, look, we're going all solar. 90% of the solar panels in the world are made in China today. There's no clear strategy for the e-waste, for the critical minerals, for the rare earths. We've got things to think about. And so maybe as Administrator Sieminski mentioned earlier, maybe that we need to be looking at tailoring our strategy in a way that's more U.S. based. What are our assets and resources? You know what? We've got an awful lot of natural gas. So maybe that should continue to play a role. And look, let me be clear. I am absolutely advocate solar, wind, thermal, hydro, wave, everything. Absolutely all of the above when they make sense. But if those are some of the assets we have, natural gas, figure out how to, as Net Power has done in Texas, pair it with new technology to where you can produce electricity from natural gas, net zero emissions at market prices. We have the largest R&D energy budget in the world. We have one of the most unstrategic strategies. Yes, I just said that. Unstrategic R&D strategies in the world as well, in that it's all loosely brought together. And we've got to be more strategic about how and more resourceful about how what we're studying and pivoting from the academic, as Adam mentioned earlier, to actually being a strategic R&D, having a strategic R&D path that allows us to advance our assets, our resources, our strengths in a way that sustains jobs, maintains affordability, and reduces emissions.
All right, Barry, we'll let you conclude.
I want to note that I yielded my time to a member of Congress. I'd never done that before. It's kind of fun. I do think at the end of the day, we've had, if you look at the 10-year run-up to Kyoto, we've had 35 years to experiment with different kinds of domestic and sub-federal policies. There are lots of models and lessons out there. We don't have time to spend another 35 years experimenting and incremental adjustment. At some point, I'm not sure that it has to be the HFC or the Montreal model, but we're going to have to scale up from Paris into something that is more rigorous, systematic, binding, and is probably going to be linked with trade and economic and international performance issues, not just emissions. We're a long, long way from that. But I do fear if we rely on very, very soft institutions, one which, by the way, the US can jump in and out of whenever the presidency changes or the mood of a president might change. It's that quick. It's that simple. We're probably going to make some progress, but not that much. And I think these soft international institutions are a setup for a system like ours, where we are so executive driven and so executive dependent and so reliant on what the current president happens to think about a particular topic. And you have these huge, huge shifts. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, but until it does, we're probably not going to make too much progress.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I thoroughly enjoyed this, especially thank you for a Saturday afternoon. So, Mark, do you have anything else to say?
No, just a huge thank you. This has been a really outstanding discussion. So,
all right, take care. Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.